Thank you for those of you who braved the cold to join us here tonight to talk about a topic that is clearly of great importance to me and to all of us. So I'm going to start just by briefly going over what most of you have heard about the diabetes epidemic, kind of review what is diabetes, what's the epidemic, why is it happening. Then talk about what are some of the risk factors for diabetes, and for that I'll specifically focus on type 2 diabetes, which I'll describe in a moment. And then we'll spend most of the time talking about some of the strategies we can use to prevent diabetes if we do not yet have it, and to manage it best if we do have it. All right, so all of you know that diabetes has become a growing health crisis. This is a cover of Newsweek from several years ago now. A growing health crisis, are you at risk? So it's a common condition. It's affecting more and more of us. So very important to understand why it's happening, why so many people are getting it. So what is diabetes? So diabetes, in brief, is basically a condition that occurs when our body either doesn't make enough insulin or insulin is not being used properly. And this causes our blood sugar level or our glucose level to increase. And when our blood sugar levels are increased, it can cause a whole host of problems, both short-term and long-term. And how do you know if your blood sugar is high? Well, some of the most common symptoms are if you're feeling more thirsty, if you're going to the washroom, urinating more frequently, if you're feeling more tired, your vision can become blurred. But often, the blood sugar can remain elevated for a long time without any symptoms at all. And there are generally two types of diabetes. There's the type 1 diabetes and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is what many of us may think of as juvenile diabetes, tends to occur in children and young adults. And that happens when the body stops producing enough insulin. And it's most commonly due to our antibodies that attack the pancreas, which makes insulin, and eventually when enough attack has taken place, these people will develop diabetes. Unfortunately, lots and lots of research has been done, but very little has been able to, we have very little to be able to prevent or halt the progression of this condition when it occurs. Very different than type 2, and these people are insulin dependent for life. Type 2, on the other hand, is the one that's really driving the diabetes epidemic. It occurs in about 90 to 95% of cases of all diabetes, mostly adult onset, although we are seeing more children now being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And that occurs first off when the body becomes more resistant to the insulin that we make. And because of that, initially, our body has to make more insulin in order to compensate for that insulin resistance. And eventually, the ability of our body to make that excess insulin starts to fail, and that's when diabetes occurs. So it's more of a longer, slow process. So, as we've alluded to, as you all know, diabetes is on the rise. This is some work that we did out of Ontario, published in The Lancet in 2007, where we showed that between 1995 and 2005, in only 10 years, diabetes rates in the adult population rose by 70%. So you can see it went from 5.2% to 6.9% to 8.8% of the adult population. And the most recent numbers tell us that over 10% of all adults in Ontario now have diagnosed diabetes. And 3 million Canadians across the country. And this attracted a lot of attention because it far surpassed what the WHO thought was only going to happen in 2030. So in 2005 in Ontario, we were already seeing rates of diabetes that the WHO was predicting that would only happen in 2030. So of course now those predictions have been revised, and we're expecting that by 2020, 1 in 8 Canadians will have diabetes. So it's definitely on the rise, and rapid. So why are diabetes rates rising? As I mentioned to you, the main driver of this rise is a rise in type 2 diabetes. So when we're talking about risk factors for diabetes and how we can prevent diabetes, we're largely going to be talking about type 2. Now, obviously, type 1 is an important type of diabetes, but it's not subject to the same kind of factors. And in fact, it's very poorly understood why children and young adults get type 1. So we're really going to focus on type 2. We know more about what the risk factors are for that condition. And of course, that's what's really driving the epidemic. So some of the reasons why we're seeing a rise in diabetes. Now, it doesn't seem to be any one reason. It seems to be several reasons that have been contributing to this increased risk. One is that our population is getting older. We've cured a lot of diseases that used to kill people at a young age, and now people are living older, and diabetes occurs more as we get older. We're screening people for diabetes more, and that might be contributing a little bit. So whereas 10 years ago, maybe less people were being tested and diagnosed, now we're seeing more people being diagnosed. So that could be one reason. But other reasons include the two other ones I've listed there. One is that Canada and Ontario in particular have seen a huge rise in immigration of populations that are at higher risk of diabetes when they develop, when they adopt a Western lifestyle. So populations from, for example, from Asia and from Africa and Central and South America. So for these people have a genetic predisposition to diabetes that is brought out when they adopt a more Western lifestyle. And because we're seeing a big rise in those populations in a lot of developed nations, but in Canada especially, that might be contributing to a rise in diabetes. But the biggest factor that people have identified as leading to an increased risk of diabetes is the concurrent rise in obesity rates. And now the latest data tell us that 2/3 of Canadians now are what we would consider overweight or obese. And that has gone up dramatically in only 10 to 20 years. And so why? Why are so many more people obese? Are we all just, weaker than we used to be, than our ancestors, and eating more and less lazier? And that's probably not the reason. It's probably due to many reasons, but first thing I want to remind people is that we as humans are engineered to conserve energy. That's how our genes are wired. We're hardwired to conserve energy. And so over time, because of that, we have adopted or engineered a more energy-conserving environment. We have made sure that lots of food is available readily for us. We have successfully made sure that we can take cars to a greater extent than we used to, and not have to we take escalators and elevators instead of stairs. There are many, many things we've done to make that's resulted in what we call an obesogenic environment. So we've successfully engineered an obesogenic environment. So, and only now are we really recognizing the harms of this environment that we've engineered. So we have much poorer diets than a generation ago. There's too much food around. We're all eating too much. And that's really true. And our lifestyle is far more sedentary. So what about the dietary changes? What have we seen? Well, I'm sure it's no surprise to you that these are data from the Canadian Community Health Survey to show you that the caloric intake per Canadian per day has went up by 18% between the 1976 and 2002, and that was 10 years ago, and you can see it really took off in the 90s. And I will point out to you that the recommended daily caloric intake for a sedentary woman is 2,000 per day. So you can see that even in the 70s, of course, people were eating a little bit more, but now, 2002, they were eating much more than the recommended daily amount of calories. And that's probably continued to rise in the last decade. And why are we eating so many more calories? Well, there's much more availability of fast food that's more caloric dense, more palatable, so we eat more of it. It's very accessible, vending machines, fast food outlets, takeout food. We have less time than we used to, so we're eating out more often. And when you eat out, you eat more. The food is more calorie dense and less healthy. So those things are all contributing to our overeating. And even when we cook at home, the norms about what a normal portion have actually changed in the last several decades. And this is a perfect example of that. If you can all remember the Joy of Cooking cookbook, that's been around since 1936. And recently, in 2006, they compared the caloric amounts of a portion in the recipes in the Joy of Cooking cookbook, and the portions have gone up. The caloric amount of the portions have gone up by 35%. So even our norms of how much we should be eating have gone up. So definitely, We're all eating more. And we're less physically active than we used to be, and I'm sure we can all recognize that. I mean, in terms of, than our ancestors or even a generation ago when we were kids. And this is just to show you again data from 10 years ago from the Canadian Communities Health Survey, looking at the proportion of Canadians who reported having active and moderate physical activity on a daily basis. And they divided up the data by 1994, 1995, and 2000, 2001, and then by those who were either had an acceptable weight or who were only overweight versus those who were more obese. So you can see that we're still, most of us are not getting regular physical activity, and that hasn't really changed. And why is that? Well, one big reason you might all recognize is that we're spending far more time in front of screens than we used to. So whether it be televisions, computers, video games, we spend a lot more time sitting down in front of screens. Most of our work now is done in front of a screen. Most of our leisure now is in front of a screen, and our kids as well. So this has really impacted on our daily activity levels. And then one issue that's generated recent attention has been a big change in the environments, the built environment in which we live. So neighborhoods that were built, in this before the 1970s were more what we would call mixed neighborhoods, where people where residential and commercial areas were mixed, so that you could actually walk to places, and the neighborhoods were considered more activity friendly and more walkable. However, because of our tendency to want to have large lands and privacy and peace, the newer neighborhoods were built where they separated lands for residential and commercial uses. And so some of the newer neighborhoods that have been built since the 1970s, have a lot of dead ends, lack sidewalks, and lack anywhere to walk. So even if you can walk in your neighborhood, where are you going to walk to? And actually, it's very interesting. They found that most people will not walk somewhere unless they can get there within 10 minutes. So, okay, so if you have a corner store 20 minutes or 30 minutes away, you're just going to take your car. But if it's 10 minutes or less away, then you're more likely to walk. So, and studies have shown that. So, and people, urban planners are now paying attention to that, and they're thinking about how they can, reverse some of these issues and think about how they can make neighborhoods more walkable, so people will actually, spend more time walking. So this has been an issue. And so, as a result, more and more of us are living in outer areas. There's greater car dependency. Even if we should be walking our dog, we don't. So we're spending more and more time in our car, right? So even if we're in front of the screen during the day, then we sit down in our car and we spend an hour in traffic each way. So you can imagine that time all adds up. There's no time left to do any kind of physical activity. Whereas before, a lot of our physical activity wasn't even necessarily leisure activity. It was just our day-to-day life, right? Now, this is a very interesting series. I'm going to show you a couple of maps, but this is work from one of my colleagues, Gillian Booth, and her colleague Rick Glazier over at St. Michael's Hospital, where they looked at some of the issues related to the built environment here in Toronto. And all of these maps are available on the internet if you look up the Toronto Diabetes Atlas. And basically what they did was, the first thing they did was they looked at the difference in the activity-friendly index of different neighborhoods in the Greater Toronto area, actually in Toronto. And the lightest shaded areas are the ones that are the least activity-friendly, and this is based on an index that has been validated, looking at whether you have places to walk, sidewalks, bike paths, stores within 10 minutes, safety, all of those things. So these areas out in the outlying areas, which were built after the 1970s, are less activity friendly, whereas you get more and more into the center of Toronto, and the activity friendliness goes up. So these are the older neighborhoods of Toronto that have more activity friendly, that are more activity friendly. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that the older neighborhoods in the center of Toronto are the most activity friendly, whereas the areas in the outlying areas are less activity friendly. And now take a look at diabetes rates in Ontario. So you can see here that it maps pretty much, not perfectly, but very closely to the activity-friendly index of these neighborhoods. Now, there may be other reasons why the diabetes rates are higher. The darker is the higher rates of diabetes in the outer areas, besides just the environment in which these people live, but it certainly isn't helping. And you can see in the center part of Toronto, the diabetes rates are much lower than in the outer areas. So that has really raised awareness regarding how the built environment might be affecting our health. Okay, so with that in mind, how do you know if you're at risk for type 2 diabetes? You know, I would argue that we all have at least one risk factor for diabetes. But I would tell you that there isn't any one cause for diabetes. Diabetes it results when a number of risk factors work together to lead to increased insulin resistance and eventually diabetes. So as an example, not everybody who's overweight will get diabetes, and not everybody who has type 2 diabetes is overweight. So, you know, there are other risk factors that also contribute to one's risk of diabetes. And so some of the risk factors are listed here, the most common being the older we get, so increasing age, the more likely you are to develop diabetes. But there are some conditions that not everyone is aware of. So for example, if a woman has been diagnosed with something called polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a condition that results in menstrual irregularities, infertility, then she also has a higher risk of diabetes. High blood pressure is associated with a higher risk of diabetes. If a woman had gestational diabetes, diabetes in her pregnancy, or if it wasn't diagnosed, if she delivered a baby over 9 pounds, her risk of diabetes is higher. If you have a first-degree relative with diabetes, particularly a parent, brother, or sister, and I'm talking about type 2 diabetes, then your risk is quite a bit higher. Certain ethnic groups I've alluded to earlier have a higher risk of diabetes, particularly when they come to Western countries. But even now more in their own countries, the rates of diabetes are going up. And these include South Asian populations, African populations, Aboriginal have a very high rate of diabetes, although this is their home, but their lifestyle also changed in the last century, which has led to harmful effects on their health. And then, of course, we talked about being overweight. When somebody is overweight, we always look at whether they have an apple or a pear shape. So pear shape is when your waist is bigger than your hips, so you carry most of your weight in your behind, whereas the apple shape is when you carry more of your weight in your waist or in your central area, and that is more risky for diabetes. So if the fat around your abdomen is more risky than the fat in your peripheral areas. And so one way to determine whether you are at risk of diabetes is to measure your waist circumference. And for women, when their waist circumference goes up beyond 35 inches, then that increases her risk of diabetes. For a man, it's 40 inches. So it's not just having excess weight, it's where you carry it. And even someone may not be overweight, but may have a very large waistline, which may lead to a higher risk of diabetes. And so how can you find out if you're at risk for diabetes? Well, luckily in the last year, the Public Health Agency of Canada has actually put together a really nice tool called the CANRISK, or the Canadian Diabetes Risk Questionnaire. And you can actually go online, and I've just put the website there. You could just go CANRISK, Google CANRISK, and you'll find it. But basically on the Public Health Agency website, you can actually take a quiz. It takes about 5 minutes, and it will give you a diabetes risk score. Okay, so based on several risk factors. Now, they will ask you to weigh yourself. They'll ask you to check your waist circumference. But the rest of it is just if you've been diagnosed with high blood pressure, if you have a relative with diabetes, what your mother and father's ethnic background is. So it takes about 5 minutes to do. It's not long. And then you will get a risk score. And this is what the risk scores mean. The risk scores are correlated with what your estimated 10-year risk of getting diabetes is. And we recommend that if you have a score over 15, that you should probably be tested for diabetes if you haven't already. And even if you're negative for diabetes now, your risk in the next 10 years is substantially higher, but 1 in 3. So you can see there what that means, and that's all on the website. So again, just to illustrate to you, it's not that simple. There isn't one cause for diabetes. So we have to look at all of our risk factors and how they all interact to increase our risk of diabetes. But as I said, most of us have at least one risk factor for diabetes. It doesn't mean we're going to get it. And basically, if you really are concerned and don't know if you should get tested, these are the recommendations. So if you're 45 years or older, all of us should have a diabetes test at least once. And the Canadian Diabetes Association recommends once every 3 to 5 years, particularly if you're at high risk. If you've had prior gestational diabetes, as I've mentioned, if your CANRISK score is over 15, as I've mentioned, or if, of course, if you have symptoms of diabetes where you're concerned that maybe your blood sugar is elevated, the symptoms, as I mentioned, thirst, urination, a blurry vision, and feeling unwell. And how do we test for diabetes? It's very simple. Most of you probably know this. It's diagnosed with a blood test. And one thing you may not know is that your doctor shouldn't give you a diagnosis of diabetes unless you've had 2 tests. So you need to have it confirmed with a second test. It doesn't have to be the same test, it could be 2 different tests, or it can be the same one. But basically, we used to say you had to have a fasting blood test for blood glucose, either the blood glucose or the 2-step oral glucose tolerance test, where you do a fasting test, they give you a drink and you test again. But now, over the last couple of years, we can now use a non-fasting blood test called an HbA1c to screen for diabetes. So even if you're in your doctor's office and you've had lunch and you want to be tested that day, you can have an initial test. If it's positive, you'll have to come back for another one. If it's negative, you can probably wait, for 3 to 5 years to be tested again.